Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is Scott Bradfield, and this is the all redesigned library edition of the bathtub. I've ever since we moved to this house, this flat, all I do is rearrange the books on the shelves because I only have so much. I'm only allowed so much room in the house for my books, which is fair. And my office is my main place for it. So I've actually look at they're actually even. I don't know why I put them. I put them up in a weird configuration in the past, but I sort of balanced them out, and I've added I can't see my closet. I think I'll take you on a book tour one of these days. One of my few devoted followers has asked for it to have a tour of my books, so I'll do that soon. So anyway, the place looks tidy. I look tidy. I have a white shirt, and I'm going to do a very untidy, as usual, presentation. This is even shaggier than usual. So I'm not even going to do one book. I'm going to do a few things. We're going to talk today more about R.A. Lafferty, the American Flann O'Brien, and Flann O'Brien, the Irish Flann O'Brien. So these are the two books I read in the past. It's been a couple weeks since I taped those last ones, and I've been reading a number of things in the bathtub, and both of these books were quite good bathtub reads. And I wanted to start by saying that one of the really considered one of the great 20th century novels now is At Swim Two Birds by Flann O'Brien. I personally much prefer The Third Policeman. So that's my don't write. I don't care. We all have different opinions. I think The Third Policeman is a work of genius, and I think this is brilliant, but it doesn't work as well for me. But this book has become very, very well regarded. It was poorly published. It came out, I think they sold 250 copies or something just before World War II broke out, and was totally ignored for many decades. It was only published because, to my mind, one of the great writers of all time was Graham Greene. And we haven't even talked about Graham Greene in the bathtub. But Graham Greene is, again, if I made my list of the top 10 books to take in the bathtub, or the top 10 authors to take in the bathtub, Greene would have to be at least the top 3 or 4. Graham Greene is one of the all-time great novelists. Any novel you pick up by Graham Greene, you should read. But one of the things I like about Greene, and I admire more and more as I get older, is he was a great reader throughout his life. And if you read his essays on books, one thing that comes through is he likes literary fiction and he likes crappy fiction. This is what the bathtub's all about. So we just read anything that's fun. And Greene will write eloquently about, basically an adventure story writer like H. Rider Haggard, and he will write eloquently about people like Flann O'Brien or J.G. Ballard. Greene was an early proponent of Kurt Vonnegut. And Greene was always spot on, and he always picked really good writers. I think Gene Reese, he was influential in helping people know about. Another great book writer for the bathtub. Anyway, anytime you see Graham Greene saying a book is good, Brian Moore, he was a big champion of Brian Moore. Whenever Greene says he likes a book, it's not the bullshit typical type of one writer scratches some other writer's back. It's always that of a real passionate reader. So one of the exciting things about going back over and reading a little bit about Flann O'Brien while I was reading At Swim Two Birds is that it was recommended to its Irish publisher by Graham Greene. And almost no one knew it was a great book except Graham Greene when it came out. So I won't say too much more. I wanted to speak a little bit about just a few similarities between these writers. So I've read these two novels. This is Flann O'Brien's first novel, At Swim Two Birds. I'll give you a quick summary, and it's a very hard book to summarize because I get lost in it. I get lost when I was reading it. It's about a kind of young studenty kid in Dublin living with his uncle, and it's really well written. Flann O'Brien writes beautiful sentences. He has it's about a young guy who's basically lazy, likes to drink and hang out with his friends, and he's writing a novel. And let me see if I can remember. The novel is about a guy who's writing a novel, and he's creating characters who all start coming back to get him, including a Puca, Pookah, who is a kind of a goblin in Irish. Again, don't correct me. I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just reading in the bathtub, okay? But as I understand it, Puca is like an Irish goblin or sprite or imp. And this Puca, among all these other characters from a lot of schlock fiction, comes back after the author, who's been invented by another author. And it becomes very hard to tell which level of reality you're in when you read the book. There are some really funny passages. There are, to my mind, some really boring passages. I may reread it again. But and for those who love it, I'm sure you're right. I had trouble following parts of it, but lots of it is great and great writing. So the Puka is this kind of sprite. All right, I'm not going to say much more about this book, but you have to read it. You do have to read it. I would recommend Third Policeman first. This is R.A. Lafferty's. We talked a few weeks ago about R.A. Lafferty's first novel, which was an ace double called Space Chanty. And that's a perfect little episodic novel. Lafferty's a short story writer. There's a lot of this feels episodic to me. It's structured, but it feels more episodic than The Third Policeman, which feels totally intact as a novel. And he writes novels as sort of assemblages of scenes and stories, Lafferty. Space Chanty kind of works because it's sort of a takeoff on the Odyssey, and it's going throughout a galactic space, and each of the chapters sort of holds together. The Reefs of Earth is, again, this is Irish-American. I don't know if he read Flann O'Brien. He might have. He did know the Catholic writers, Catholic fanlicists like G.K. Chesterton is pretty clear. But this is about a group of kids and children living somewhere in the middle of somewhere. I forget where it is. Is it in the? I keep wanting to say I think it's in the bayous. It's somehow in Louisiana. I may be wrong. And they're called Puca. And the Puca and goblins constantly arise in Lafferty's work. What he's best at, particularly in this book, are just sort of episodic stories. So it starts off with all these children who are Puca, who are actually aliens from another planet. And they go through this world causing mayhem and hilarious, ridiculous story events. And in the beginning, each of the children tells a story. And these little stories are odd, eccentric, written in a very odd style, very different, discordant style compared to someone like Flann O'Brien. But they are hilarious and they really require attention. The Reefs of Earth is definitely worth reading. It's his second published novel, I think. It's very episodic and it's best in the first half of the book when it's just going from one story to another. And I can't even just summarize it. It's just he's continually inventive, Lafferty. Like O'Brien, in At Swim Two Birds, there's lots of different ideas, one of which is that authors engender people and create human life by imagination. And at one point, there's one of the characters who's created by one of the hack authors in the book. She's raped and murdered. It's a schlock western, I think, and the author of it her life is talked about as how she was born and an hour later she was raped and murdered. So their life expanse actually occurs in the pages of a book, and O'Brien takes that one little premise, like he does in Third Policeman, and he goes off in a huge riff of invention about what happens when we create human life through fiction. And the whole book is a game on that. I'm reading in conjunction with the Lafferty novel and with At Swim Two Birds, I was dipping into and finishing the second volume of the Lafferty complete collected fictions. And this is, again, from Centipede, incredibly beautiful books. And this is a little easier to help you understand just the invention of Lafferty and, by comparison, Flann O'Brien. Each story is extraordinary in its invention. It comes up with ideas I've never really seen done before. The opening story, The Man with the Aura, is about a guy who creates an invention which it makes everybody like him, even when he does horrible things. And that dissonance between the guy going around doing horrible things and everybody saying, "Oh, you're really a sweet guy. It was so nice of you. Why would anyone think you murdered your family? Or why would you do?" It's a brilliant story. There's also lots of Puca in this, and goblins, and stories which are often just a sequence of fairy tales about goblins going around wreaking havoc in usually the Midwest. They're goblins in sort of an Irish folktale tradition, and also Indian Native American narratives. And there is a sort of sense of disconnection from the characters. So we don't have the first persons, we don't have close point of view in the stories. We're often jumping around from different characters in these large, fabulous narratives in Lafferty, which feel like trickster narratives and feel like Native American folk tales. The first story, the man with the aura, is hilarious, and there's another story in here called Ride a Tin Can, which is another, just basically an assemblage of little fairy tales about goblins. There's also one called Old Halloweens on the Guna Slopes. There's several stories in this particular volume where we just have one invention after another of a peculiar story. So we'll have one short story in which there's 5 or 6 kind of brilliant ideas you've never seen before, and they're kind of sewn together in this little kind of mini Decameron or mini Canterbury Tales. So anyway, you've got to pick up. You can get a lot of stuff cheap on eBay and paperback, and you can also get a lot of them on Kindle, especially the short stories. There was one last thing I wanted to add about all of this. Reading about Flann O'Brien, there's never been a good biography of Lafferty. There may be one coming along. There's never really been a proper biography of Flann O'Brien. So most of the stuff I'm getting on Flann O'Brien comes from this I bought on eBay. You get this for like $3 or $4, and it's by Bloomsbury, Peter Costello, and Peter Van de Kamp. It's one of these, they did a lot of these at one time, heavily illustrated. I'm only halfway through this. Heavily illustrated, lots of photography and pictures of Flann O'Brien, whose real name was Brian O'Nolan. Brian O'Nolan. He had several pseudonyms, including, and I don't, Miles Nagapoline, I believe. Please don't write. I don't care if I pronounced it right or not. But he wrote all these columns for the newspapers, and actually I've never read these, but as Miles, he was better known. His novels were not really well known in his lifetime. And this is about the best biography there is. There's not a really proper standard biography of O'Brien. And there's one written by a friend of his, which I have not yet read, Anthony Cronin. But if you're interested in him, as I am, increasingly over the years, those are the books to read. There's nothing on Lafferty, though maybe that's coming along. You can't go wrong with either of these writers. They have a great deal of similarities, and particularly interesting sort of folk tale and fantastic narratives. There was one other story in here I loved. I can't remember. There's one about the idea there's the Hollow Earth Society. There's 2 societies in one of these short stories. There's the Hollow Earth Society versus the Flat Earth Society. The Flat Earth Society lives out here, where you and I live, I think, out here in the world. And I think it's called All Hollow Though You Be. And then there's these creatures, these people driving around in these big underground mole machines or something, and they're just popping up out of the earth and going back in. And again, it's insane, and yet narratively completely controlled by Lafferty. And he really knows how to finally tie these little stories together. They work incredibly well. All right, so you can't go wrong. You should definitely read these someday. And the Reefs of Earth, the novels are not Lafferty's best stuff, but at the same time, they contain much of his best stuff. And you have to read Swim Two Birds someday. I took a while getting it through it myself. I tried it many times and couldn't finish it, and eventually finally finished it because of my love for The Third Policeman, really. But there is many, many brilliant passages in it, as there are in all of O'Brien and all of Lafferty. All right, I went longer than I wanted to. I'll see you next week in the bathtub. Bye. Oh, I didn't turn that off.